We will be talking today about why hardware development is more like a marathon of obstacles than maybe an easy 5K run that a lot of people may think about as we come into it. My name is Jenny Lober, and I am the Director of Operations at Solutions. I've got over two decades of manufacturing experience as well as quality engineering and supply chain management. I've transitioned dozens of products to manufacturing and seen some of the challenges associated with products going to the manufacturing floor really before they're ready to be designed. In my current role, I have a lot of conversations with people trying to navigate hardware development for the first time, and really am trying to empathize with the challenges where they're trying how to do engineering, how to develop a product, and also launch this new product. I'm joined today by my business partner, Chuck Hodges.
Hey, y'all. I'm Chuck Hodges. I'm a co-founder of Zebulon Solutions and currently CEO. Started out my career in Silicon Valley, got my master's from Stanford, did the requisite Silicon Valley thing, a bunch of stuff, 5 of them, not counting Zeb, but got one good exit out of it, which is probably better than average, I guess. Company I was with got sold to a contract manufacturer called Flextronics, pretty small company at the time, but grew and grew and grew. I was an executive there for over a dozen years, and I actually established their design services group, and we worked on some pretty cool products, Palm Pilot, Xbox, to name a few. And like Jenny, I've got many dozens of product launches under my belt, and we're very excited to be here. It's our first webinar, so thank you for joining.
Yeah, so as with a lot of webinars, we're going to try and take questions. If we say something that is really interesting to you, we appreciate comments. And then also, if you do have questions, feel free to put them up there. If they're relevant to the subject, we'll try and engage with them as much as possible. For things that might be a little bit off subject, we may wait until the end. But we are hoping for a lot of engagement and interesting half hour. So let's go ahead and get into what we're talking about today. This is really the first in the series of webinars that we're hoping to do. The origination of this series came out of a lot of those conversations I have with people. Their description of what the product, of trying to go through the hardware product development process for the first time, really reminded me of something like running a marathon for the first time through an obstacle course in the dark. They were constantly stumbling over obstacles and they had no idea where they were headed on the journey. So the purpose of this series is really to demystify the process and set a proper expectation about what is ahead. What we're presenting is not new or revolutionary. You can probably Google it and get a lot of the same information, but we'll try and make it a little bit more interesting than just Googling something. The series will include what makes the journey long, how the decisions that are made early in the process really impact the trajectory, the time, and the cost. We'll talk about how to intentionally utilize the iteration process to propel development forward, as opposed to obstacles that keep tripping you up. And then we'll talk about how to successfully launch a product into manufacturing.
So in our webinar today, we're going to be looking at really kind of 3 things. First off, the expectations for developing a new product, then the reality of the many challenges, this marathon over the obstacle course in the dark. Hopefully we can solve the dark problem at least. And then how to get a little expert advice that can accelerate line and help you manage your costs along the way.
So let's look at our first section. We're going to begin looking at the mindset that many have coming into hardware development. It's approaching it like a 5K run, excuse me. Expecting the process to be fairly straightforward and predictable. They understand it's going to take some time, it's going to take some money, but it's well within their scope of something they can do. We'll discuss how some of the risks and the results of oversimplifying the effort in our first section here.
Right. The process as seen by the novice is get an idea, protect it, design it, build it, get rich, retire, buy the yacht, right? And at a high level, this isn't wrong, not at all, but it is really oversimplified. And there's some danger in starting out with the wrong expectations on this. I will point out that middle block that we had up there, design, is underestimated. This is a pretty big task if you have a serious If this is not a simple toy or a pet rock, and it can be very serious if it's a medical device or something for mil aerospace and things like that. So there's a lot of test and refinement. There's going to be iterations we're going to talk about at length here. So don't underestimate that block in the middle. And then the last point is more of a current events. The supply chain's been messed up since COVID. Don't underestimate how tough it can be to get a supply chain set up.
Absolutely. Yeah, underestimating an expensive and long task can have disastrous consequences. I mean, maybe in best case, it's just a loss of reputation that would be recoverable. But I mean, even all the way to really serious health issues that you're dealing with. Looking at like what some of the not reaching those business objectives, which probably when most people walk into starting a new venture, think about the business objectives alone. There's fear about it's going to cost more than expected. You may have to go out for more funding rounds than you're planning on. And if your development depends on funding, then you're delaying your market entry. And depending on the product you're developing, that might have issues around trying to even generate a customer base after that, which would result in disappointed investors and their slow ROI. And then having underfunded or maybe even not able to develop the technology entirely could result in the business closing down and kind of the failure from that perspective.
Yeah, I'll say I closed down 4 startups before I got my. And let's be clear, we're not saying don't set stretch goals. We're not saying don't go for the brass ring, don't go for that 1B market. And oftentimes the right answer is better to ask forgiveness. But understand the reality, know your data, know what your real numbers are. I had a mentor early on who told me, Chuck, don't believe your own pitch deck. And that's a good piece of advice.
Yeah, I think that's easy to do when you're pitching continually. It's easy to believe everything you're saying, right? I think some of the other underestimated issues, you might have disappointed customers. If you're doing a crowd funding round to raise funds for development or manufacturing, you may push out your delivery dates or fail to bring the product to market. One thing that I see pretty commonly with initial products getting the market, especially out of the crowdfunding area, is that there's performance issues or reliability problems because they didn't save enough time in the development cycle for testing the product to ensure that's worked out. Touched on this a little bit before, but on the personal side of things, there's nothing in business that's worth sacrificing your own life or even the life of your friends and family and the relationships you have there. So, I mean, keeping an eye on physical exhaustion and personal bankruptcy are important as well.
All right, so let's talk about strategy for a second, the big picture. It's important to have, and just like if your business strategy, you're going to use strategy for product development. This can set as well the right expectations for not only yourself, but also your customers, as Jenny's mentioned. This is huge. If you get an unreliable product out there, if it's buggy, if it breaks, those customers aren't going to be customers very long. And let's not forget other stakeholders. You may have co-founders. You're almost certainly going to have employees if you're fortunate enough to get to that stage. Key suppliers, contractors, they're all counting on you too. And then last but not least, and certainly the thing entrepreneurs think about the most is their investors. I will point out that serious investors that invest in hardware products, they know actually what we're talking about here. They know this is tough. They know it's not software. Frankly, it scares off some investors to do this, but those that do invest are going to understand that this is a big lift to get a hardware product out there. Don't be afraid to put out numbers that have some zeros behind them. Don't be afraid to get out in front of that and say, yes, we know this is tough, but we got a great team. We've researched this. We know what we're doing. So be realistic about it. Don't try to oversell it because you'll actually scare away some of the people who might become your best investors.
Yeah, I think underestimating on how you're presenting it can certainly provide kind of a negative view to investors that would otherwise be interested in investing in hardware products. So let's get into the second section here and look at some of the aspects around hardware development that make it more like running a marathon of obstacles. We'll look at some of the unexpected challenges, why redesigns and restarts are common, but then also how those iterations can really be an advantage to you and not an obstacle.
So even for the experienced hardware developer, even with a world-class team, and I've had the good fortune of working with a number of those over the years, this is still a marathon, and there's still going to be obstacles.
This is a process that we use at Zebulon Solutions. We intentionally plan to navigate the unexpected challenges through 7 stages. Concept, patent I have up there even though we don't do a lot with it, proof of concept or MVP, minimum viable product, the alpha revision, beta revision, finally getting it into production for the first time in pilot, and then setting up stable, scalable production. I'm only mentioning these now, and we'll dive into some of the details of these in future webinars, but it's noteworthy that it is a significant F stage that I've listed above. And we will support people regardless of their entry point into the process. So we don't always start at the beginning and run through the end. There's many people who engage with us halfway through because that's where they are, and they're thinking seriously about getting into production.
I will say that we also, some of our customers have gone through and then have come back through an iteration loop, and we start up there. I will point out this graphic, Jenny, is oversimplified. If we drew out the real one, it would look like a flow chart with checkpoints, branches, lots of loops. So take this with a grain of salt, and it does depend on the class of product. A medical device is going to have a lot more loops and iterations and regulatory aspects, for example, than a toy. Although don't underestimate the Consumer Product Safety Commission stuff.
Exactly. Right. And so we know that it's going to be an arduous endeavor. Part of it is because this product has never existed before. No one knows anything about it, including the inventor, and there's a lot to be learned about it. And so we use iterations as the tool to learn about the product. They're not obstacles on the iterations, but they're very intentional about what we are doing as we're trying to learn about this product. We use testing and evaluations that will help us learn as much as possible as early as possible. It gets much more expensive to learn about things the farther we go in this process, with tooling and other capital expenditures that can really bog down and cause a major delay in the development timeline. Some of the learning that we go through is going to be surprising because it's never existed before. We don't know what all the answers are going to be until we have tested something in the conditions it's going to be used. And when those surprising answers come up, sometimes that will force a redesign or a restart if it's really a significant something we couldn't predict until we get into it. There's also learning that happens through experience. And by using a mature team who has experience around how to develop hardware products, there's many major pitfalls we're able to avoid. For the novice, without having that experience, you may not find out until you get ready to set up manufacturing. As an example, you need to completely change the way you're approaching your plastic design because it's not actually able to be fabricated in a volume manufacturing environment.
All right, so let's talk about one of my favorite topics, which is iterations. Everybody knows that there's costs and there's time associated, and there's almost this, oh, it's badness. But I would actually argue, embrace the iteration. Understand it, but embrace it. And this is an area where many first-time inventors, many first-time entrepreneurs in the hardware space go wrong. They think, oh, those costs, I mean, I want to iterate, that's going to add cost to my schedule. Design time, materials, tooling, as Jenny mentioned, and even 3D printing isn't cheap. And certainly board spins are not cheap on the printed circuit board. But the real answer is this is cheaper than any of the other ways to do it. When I started out as an engineer, and yes, I have some gray in the beard, we did things differently. We simulated stuff to death. We checked our calculations and quadruple checked things and stuff like that because iterations were really expensive back then. And honestly, it could be career limiting if you were the one that had a design that had to be spun, right? And that's absolutely changed. In the software world, of course, we have everything shifted to agile, and while hardware isn't quite as easy to do that, we still follow the same concepts. Get out in front of it, design it, test it, learn from it, fail early, and then go to the next iteration.
And I think one thing we've made the assumption is that iterations are going to happen, and whether you plan for iterations, they will happen. And so we've tried really hard to plan intentionally for them and budget around them. But I think also looking on the time side of things, because iterations don't just cost money, but they do take time. Engineers are going to need time to research solutions and then design out products. Prototyping, we do not live in the land of the Star Trek replicator. And so, even in 3D printing, which is much faster than some of the older ways of doing fabrication in the past, it can still take hours, if not days, to print certain products. And then if you've got to print multiple ones of those, it's going to take, X amount of that as well. Shipping materials, I mean, most of the time we try and do things locally, but if you've got something you've got to ship from the other side of the world, overnight is still 2 or 3 days, I think. Once you get everything in your house and you're ready to build it, it's going to take time to put those little pieces together. And if they don't quite fit the way you thought they did, you're going to be tweaking them and hopefully making notes about what you need to change in the next go round. And then if you find things that you've got to change, then it's going back and repeating the process all again, repeating the tests, and it can take time to do that. Some of the testing we do could be really quick, though. We could do drop testing, which is a second, depending on how far we're dropping it from. But if we get into reliability or life testing, it can take weeks or months because we need to make sure that the products are going to work over the expected lifetime in the environmental conditions they're going to be in.
Yep, and testing really can't emphasize enough. You want to do this at so many levels. You want to do it on the engineering bench. You want to do it in the lab. We do a lot of testing in temperature chambers and other extended life chambers. We're 8 months on a project right now in terms of in the hands of friendly customers because they'll give you insights that you won't have. But you want to have done some testing before you put it in their hands, obviously. But don't be afraid to break things. Don't be afraid to do that drop test. And if it works at a meter, take it to 3 meters. I mean, we've literally done it from the tops of step ladders. We've gone on the roof. We want to test your products to their limits. You want to see how far you can push them because you're going to learn from this. Even if it breaks, there's learning involved. And that's part of this iteration of you break it and then you say, okay, now I'm going to do something different.
I think if we think back to the original iPhone that came out, everyone was breaking their iPhones the very first time they dropped them on the floor because I think Apple failed to drop them from tabletops. But anyway, the repetition of testing and evaluation, adjustment, and retesting can seem endless and arduous if you're unprepared. Perhaps some of you are thinking, though, how can one prepare for the obstacles when I've never even done this before? So let's talk through that. First of all, I would encourage you, manage the mindset. There will be iterations, there possibly will be restarts, and so walk into this acknowledging that there's going to be some bumps in the road. Acknowledge that this is the natural cycle of hardware development, and it's not actually a never-ending barrage of obstacles. Be aware of the mental exhaustion when it always seems like the finish line is on the horizon, but find ways to mark progress so that you can see that you are moving forward from the starting line. Focus on learning as early. Change is much cheaper early on than it is later in the process. And then view testing as the tool to the learning. Don't plan to stop iterating until the design is refined, but I want to caution you to iterating to perfection because you'll never actually get there. I think we're on iPhone 15 now or whatever. Yep. They're still iterating, right? But stop when the product meets you and your customer's requirements. Achieve what is good enough for that first release, and then push everything else to the second version.
Yeah, that's absolutely true that while we stress iteration is good, it doesn't mean endless, and it doesn't mean just throwing good money after bad either. So we're going to be smart about it, and getting a product out that's good enough really helps, right? And a lot of the world-class companies out there do this routinely, as Jenny mentioned. The thing you do have to keep an eye on is all your resources to avoid depleting those resources. The obvious one is money. I mean, you run the bank account and goes dry in startups. This is the fear every founder, every entrepreneur has. But it's not just the money. It's time to market. Your customers are waiting for a product. Your competitors are also racing you. The customers won't have infinite patience, unfortunately. And should also mention that sweat equity, which is what many startups correctly rely on, I've certainly put a lot of them into my startups, that's not infinite either. So, understand that while you are going to plan on and have a strategy for some iterations and stuff like that, it can't go infinite. And sometimes you got to get a product out there and generate some cash flow.
Yeah, so the good enough is important to figure out what the market will tolerate. So as we've already discussed some of the ways to handle some of the setbacks, let's just review those again for a quick second. So know in advance that the iterations are going to occur, and already knowing that will adjust your expectation around that. Acknowledge this is a learning process, and learning can be difficult. Remember going through school, not every subject was just a breeze, at least not for all of us, I'm sure. There were things that were a challenge. Same thing with some products. There are going to be pieces of developing a product that are more difficult to get through than others. The product has never existed before, and there's a lot you've got to learn. And there's going to be some trial and error as you learn what works and what doesn't. And then recognize when you need help and reach out to experts.
All right, which good segue into our last section today. We look at what experts you can engage with. Step one, of course, is to consider what your core competencies are. Be honest with yourself. This is what I'm good at. This is what I want to become good at. And think through the cost side of it, because your money is certainly one of those resources that depletes. How can I leverage third parties to help me get to my end goal much quicker? And then the last piece, of course, the value that bringing some true experts into the game in areas where you may not have already done this before. Bring in people that have.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there's no one is all knowing in everything. You can be good at a whole bunch of things, but you're not going to be good at everything. It's important to understand and acknowledge your weaknesses. Engage with complementing skill sets. That can accelerate your development time, and it will be actually an efficient use of resources. In many ways, it may actually cost less and be shorter than if you try and do everything on your own for the sake of conserving resources. Identify, as Chuck said, what skills you want to have and what you don't want to have. Hire experts in those areas and consider both your professional skill set, but also the skill set of your business. Keep going. Okay.
All right, so this is really important that you want to focus on your own professional growth as an entrepreneur, and those are your co-founders and team, and know what that core competency is. But there's limits to all that as well. Our customers aren't even in the hardware business, to be honest. They're in the data mining business, or they're in software as a service, and they need a widget to create this. We've got a couple chemistry customers that their core competency is really chemistry. The hardware widget is just a means to an end. So if you fall in that category, this advice is even more apparent. Remember that there's lots of outsourced firms out there, ranging from legal to finance, marketing, which we use, design. Folks like us, and supply chain are areas that may not be your core competency, or you may not need them the entire period of time. Remember also, a trusted advisor is more than just a hired hand. Both Jenny and I have done fractional COO engagements where our end game was to hire our replacement or promote somebody from within into the role. A good expert can also provide insight. This really does. And then also early on, especially as you're building your business plan, having some little expert look at those critical things like your schedule, your timelines, your budget for development, and of course the all-important manufacturing cost estimates.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think by leveraging experts, you're also able really to save time, as I've mentioned, for areas that are outside of your skill set. So I think, if you think as an example, if you're got a great marketing background, but you have a really interesting idea for hardware, it might make sense to outsource the design. It would be more efficient and less frustrating than learning how to do engineering and learning how your product is working at the same time. You can save money as for those areas that are not really within your expert experience. So you might be an electrical engineer and you probably can figure out how to design a mechanical enclosure. But some of the experience a mechanical engineer would bring to the table is knowing how to manufacture that mechanical enclosure and avoid it before you can actually get it manufactured. And you can also save resources by knowing when to delegate. While you might be able to buy all the parts and navigate the supply chain, it can be extremely time consuming. And so by offloading the tracking down the parts and following up on deliveries and managing suppliers, you're able to focus more on your business core.
Yep, and get your best people working on what they're best at. And I'll even point out that, well, it's slightly counterintuitive because everybody thinks, oh, experts are expensive, third parties are expensive. In the early days, you're using many of these skill sets very fractionally. If you only need 100 hours of a certain skill over the course of a year, it's much, much, much more cost effective to outsource that than it is to bring it in-house. Even the fractional executive services like what we offer, I mean, 25% of Jenny's time as a COO is a lot cheaper than hiring a professional COO. I mean, the recruitment fees alone pays for her for a couple of years. So it can be cost effective to your budget as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that hopefully this has been a useful session for everyone who's joined us today, and provided some better set the expectation for hardware development, and you've been able to take away some of the key insights. some of the things that, as we put this together, that we wanted to be sure you had picked up on was, first of all, that hardware development isn't just an easy 5K, but it is an arduous marathon due to the amount of learning that's going to be necessary.
Iterations are important, but embrace the concept, understand the impact on budget and schedule, and go for it.
Redesigns out of those iterations may end up happening, and that restarts will happen as you learn about your product.
Yep. And understand your core competency, outsource the rest. I'm not the first person to say that, but it's absolutely true.
Right. And hopefully through all of that, it will just make the journey less arduous. So thank you all for joining us today. Before we wrap up, are there any questions that we could answer about the topics we've presented? Now we have to wait a minute for the questions to type. I know, right? Question. Let's see, I'm working on a project with a PCBA. How many iterations should I expect during development?
Oh, that's a good one. So here's something I always tell people to do. Wander around your house and find old electronics. Don't break anything new, but pop it open if you're into this kind of stuff.
Break open an old one.
There's a green board hiding inside there, not always green, but usually, and that's the printed circuit board, and it'll have somewhere buried on it a revision. I guarantee you it's never going to be a 1 or an A. It's going to be a 7 or a 9 or a 3 or an E or an F. Let's see, over here we've got, okay, yes, here we go. This was one of the original Palm Pilot prototype boards. This was very early. You can see some of the wires. You can see the piezo speaker glued on there in an awkward position under where the memory was supposed to go. Really early prototype. It's still Rev 2. And when we were probably on, actually B, sorry. But we were probably on F or G by the time this got released. It was a groundbreaking product, but it's not a nuclear missile or a medical device. It's just essentially a pre-cell phone. So you will have iterations that happens.
I'll say while we're waiting for another question, I'll make a comment on that when I was in aviation, we actually did all the revisions up through F or G. And then before we released it to the market, we took everything back to A.
I have seen that one.
So I will just say that you might see them in A if they're playing the iteration.
Yeah, it's cheating.
Yes, indeed. Let's see, a question. What types of changes would be included in an iteration? I get to take that one. So I encourage people to think about a change that is going to give you some information. Don't make such a small change that you're going and repeating the tests unnecessarily. You'll burn through cash, and maybe you're just going to learn one tiny little thing. On the flip side of this, I've seen, and this is more common with hardware and people that are new to hardware, trying to wrap a ton of changes and a whole bunch of things into a single iteration. And then when you run the test, something doesn't work, and now it's difficult to unravel what broke, and then you end up having to take it and cause more retests and more expense and time.
Right, disambiguating which change caused it to go wrong, or even which one made it better is sometimes tough that way. So sometimes you need to measure your changes. Sometimes you go for the home run, but not always.
Yeah. Let's see. Or anything else? Maybe one last one. How do you know what to test? Requirements. I'll throw that out there. You can add on
requirements. Yeah, we'll talk about that in another webinar. But get your requirements down early on. What does it need to do, and then that will drive what you have to test. I will say there's lots of good test labs out there. We use a local company, Element. Shout out to them; they're great. But companies like that will test anything you want. Figuring out what to test is super important. But figure out what you need it to do, and then find time, because some of these tests do take months and months. Efficient method to do it. I want one more quick comment though on tests though. It can be concurrent. You can be testing while you're changing the design and stuff like that, especially those longer life tests too. So I know it's slightly off topic.
That's all right. We could have a whole webinar on testing alone. But
I hope we do eventually.
Yeah. Well, we're getting real close to our time, so slide here. I'm going to put that up on the screen. I want to thank you all for your time and your engagement today. Really, this has only been an introduction to the Marathon of Hardware Development. As mentioned previously, Zebulon Solutions, we break the marathon into 7 stages, and we will discuss all of those in future webinars. In parallel with the webinar series, we are releasing a series of blogs on the same topics, and those should be posted to our website over the next few weeks. I'm hoping to get today's topic up before the end of the week, but we'll see how that goes. Our website is zebulonsolutions.com. We'll be on our YouTube channel, site of contact page info at zebulonsolutions.com. Our next webinar is going to look at how to take your idea from your head and convert it into something you can see, touch, and share with others. As a reminder, when starting a new venture, it's always good to engage with those who have successfully done it before. Experts whose core competency is getting you to the finish line can save you resources in the long run, whether it's designing your product or getting manufacturing set up. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next time.
We did pick up a couple more comments while you were doing the last spiel there too, Jen. So this is cool. Elson says, I find so many businesses do not outsource. Oh, there we go. He's got it on the
outsource experts and find it very costly in the end because the focus is on the core competency. Expertise becomes limited. You bet.
Yes, I think that's some of that is just the I want to build my empire. Some of it's well-meaning too. And again, the core competency part, totally get. If your core competency is software, hire a whole bunch of software. Core competency is something that's chemistry, maybe not.
Right. Focus on that. All right. Well, thank you again for everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next time.
And thank you, everybody.